A lot of drum loops, even if it is comped with multiple different drum parts, you can go in there with an EQ and change the timbre of the kick as if you had a different sample there in the first place. So a common issue I think a lot of producers run into is they have a really cool drum loop that they like in their track, but they're just not feeling so good about the sound of some of the drums in that loop. Oftentimes it's something like the kick drum. So here we have a loop I'm using in this track right here. And it works really well in the kind of track I'm trying to create, but the kick drum is kind of very small sounding. It's very forward, very mid-rangey, very boxy sounding. And a lot of producers would find a loop sort of like this, and for whatever reason they say, I don't really like the kick, I'll just try and find another loop. Or they'll try and layer a sample underneath that kick, and that could take a long time because not every loop is perfectly warped, to your grid. So you have to kind of like zoom in really close and make sure that the kick lines up with it and isn't out of phase. So that can actually be really time consuming, and I think a secret is a lot of people don't realize you can just change the kick. A lot of drum loops, even if it is comped with multiple different drum parts, you can go in there with an EQ and change the timbre of the kick as if you had a different sample there in the first place. So here's the original again. Now with some processing. So you probably can tell it's very clear that the kick is much more of a subby bass kick as opposed to the original, which is like boxier and smaller sounding. And I did this through a couple of simple steps. The biggest part is the EQ. So here I have FabFilter Pro Q. You could use this with the EQ8 in Ableton. You could use it with the parametric EQ in FL. Really anything that's like a visual EQ where you can see what's going on. And even though this looks kind of complicated, there's actually really three things going on. So down here, I'm just cleaning up the lows. So right off the bat, a lot of people don't even realize this, but there's not a necessity for your kick drum to even have frequencies below 30 hertz necessarily. Now, if you're trying to have a very subby kick, yeah, those frequencies are there, but oftentimes just cleaning up the very low end on something and high passing your kick drum sound actually makes it tighter in the mix. So a lot of people don't realize that, and it's actually wreaking havoc on someone's mix because there's like so much energy down there. So that's one thing. If I go to the other side of the frequency spectrum, I've got like this dip here. So why am I doing this? I'm going to solo the drums, and basically if I take these off, you can visually see right up here is basically the hi-hat in that loop. And I wanted it to just be a little less bright, a little less brittle sounding, a little more warmer, darker, more lo-fi. So I just cut some of the frequencies up above. So here's the original. Then with some cut. The hi-hat sound is a little bit warmer now. And then I'm cutting the mids out of here, and this is where that kick drum really was sitting. A lot of times when you have a boxy kick, scooping out the mids is gonna give it some clarity because you're taking all that mid-range or low mids out of it. That's the body or the boxiness of the sound is down there. So if you have a kick that just feels a little bit muddy or crowded, if you scoop the mids, it might sound clear. And that's a nice thing. And then the secret weapon here, if you're trying to change your kick drum, especially if it's in a comp loop, like in this example, you can basically create a bell curve that's actually fairly sharp. You can see the band to Q. It's not broad. It's not like that. It's actually fairly sharp. And that's creating a bump in the resonance on that kick drum. So that's kind of pushing the frequencies up where I want them to be to change the sound of the kick and creating more focus and energy right around here at 70 hertz, whereas a lot of the energy in the original kick was kind of like up in the mids and giving it that boxy sound. So I'm cutting that and I'm boosting this. And what's so cool about FabFilter is I can make this dynamic. So by making this dynamic, it's also going to respond, and this is what this lever or this fader here is for. And as I play the sound, you can see this is now a dynamic EQ. Okay, so let's listen to the sound now without this EQ and then with it so we can hear the difference once again. So still, listen to that kick. It's very small, very different sounding. Now here's the EQ. And then I'm just going to go in here and add some saturation. This helps glue the sound together. So here it is without, with, and you can hear it's pushing that kick a little more forward, adding some harmonics, gluing the sound together, which is a great trick once you've done all this surgical EQ to add some saturation so that you can kind of glue the thing back together after all those changes you've done to the frequency. You could use any saturation plugin. This is just one I like to use. The last trick is your compression, which further glues the sound together dynamically. Even if you get a loop from a sample pack that's already technically processed, if you've done stuff to it to really change its sound design, it helps to have a compressor there to sort of tie it together. So now what I'm going to do is add this compressor. So what this is going to do is control some of those low frequencies, glue the sound together, and sort of make it sound a little more punchy too, which this compressor from Waves, the RS124, is really great at doing. Now here it is with. So again, here's another quick example of this technique in action. So I've got another drum loop here. This is sort of a kick with oddly like a cymbal attached to it. And what I wanted to do is change the sound of this loop. So I go in and I grab an EQ, and you'll see here that I'm basically cutting out a lot of the highs, including that cymbals sort of ring here at 3300 hertz, taking out the mids. I've got my resonant bump, and I'm taking everything off 30 hertz and below, especially because I have a sub bass. I have a synth or a Reese bass in the track. Then with. So notice how the balance of the two sounds, the kick and the cymbal sort of attached to it, the balance and the tone of that thing in the loop completely changes just using this EQ. It's almost as if I'm using a completely different kick sound, like I've replaced it in that loop. And all I did was use an EQ. And on the parallel channel, I've got a compressor. This is a really great aggressive sounding compressor by Slate, kind of modeled after a famous hardware unit. And that's going to help sort of create a lot of sustain under the sound and kind of fill things up a little bit. So here it is without, with, so you notice it adds even more energy and oomph behind the kick, and there's a lot more sustain behind the cymbal as well. So here it is without anything on it. Now with. Most DAWs have something like this. You don't have to use FabFilter. It's a great plugin, but you can use EQ8. You can use Parametric EQ2 in FL Studio. Logic has channel EQ. So, and Pro Tools has an EQ that's similar to this as well. It's a bit smaller and it's graphic, but you could use this one. It doesn't really matter. The one thing that FabFilter has over those other EQs, at least at the moment, the stock DAW EQs, is it allows you to create a dynamic EQ, a dynamic response in that resonant bump. You can see I'm using quite a bit of it here. So this is where it sits statically, but the illustration in blue is actually where it pushes that resonant bump in the bass frequencies. That comes in handy for shaping the transient in that frequency range, so you have a dynamic response. Still, this is a technique you can use basically anywhere as long as you have an EQ where you can see what's going on and you can make these specific changes.